So we are at about 2:30 and want to honor everybody's time and we'll get started. All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Mark Durgan. I'm the project director for the Pennsylvania Care Partnership. And we want to welcome everybody to today's webinar and our webinar speaker series sponsored and provided by the PA Care Partnership in association with the Office of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. Today we have over 1,500 people registered to attend, with some watching on YouTube. So welcome our YouTube friends. Our moderators today are Nancy Massey and Jamal Ford. We'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. My pleasure to welcome Dr. Dana Winters, who is the Director of Simple Interactions and Academic Programs and the Assistant Professor of Child and Family Studies at the Fred Rogers Center. She contributes significantly to expanding the use of simple interactions as an approach for adult-child and adult-to-adult interactions across multiple contexts in the service of children and the adults who help them. She leads a team at Fred Rogers to use simple interactions to support child-serving professionals across early childhood and other developmental contexts. My pleasure to welcome Dr. Winters.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be with everyone today in whatever way with means now. A year ago, with meant a little bit different, but we're getting used to this way too. Go ahead and get started here. As Mark mentioned, I am from the Fred Rogers Center, the Fred Rogers Center for Early Learning and Children's Media. We're located in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, about an hour east of Pittsburgh. And if you are familiar with Mr. Rogers and Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, you'll know that Latrobe is his hometown. So I'm coming to you today from the original Mr. Rogers neighborhood in Latrobe. The Fred Rogers Center was envisioned by Fred. It was something that when he was ending his time in television and wondering what came next, he wanted to continue to serve children and their families and their helpers, and wanted to do so on a college campus. He wanted to have a center that was devoted to continuing that learning and that sharing. And so he established his center, he established his archive first at the University of Pittsburgh. And then when it came time to start the center, was looking at possible options of colleges to do so. And there were an awful lot of places that were interested, of course, the University of Pittsburgh being right there in his new neighborhood. Carnegie Mellon was right down the street also from WQED, where he filmed Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And there were schools around the country that were really interested. He chose St. Vincent College in Latrobe for two reasons. One, because Latrobe is his hometown. But two, I was saying with talking with Nancy when we were getting started, St. Vincent College is the oldest Benedictine monastery in North America. And so since 1846, St. Vincent College has been here as a monastery and a college not too long after that. And the archabbot at the time, Archabbot Douglas Nowicki, used to be the director of education for the Diocese of Pittsburgh and was a dear friend of Fred's. So when it came time for Fred to entrust his archive and his legacy, he entrusted it to friends. And here at the center, we are certainly glad that we are among the Friends of St. Vincent and among the Friends in Latrobe here and in the Pittsburgh region as well. Now, the work that we do at the center is slightly different than the work that Fred did on the program of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. We are not in the business of producing media. That's Fred Rogers Productions in Pittsburgh. The center here is committed to serving children and families and helpers throughout the legacy of Fred Rogers. And the majority of our work is focused very much on those families and helpers. And that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about, is the importance of our helpers. Now, we are home to the archive of Fred Rogers, which is about 22,000 cataloged items from his life, including the scripts from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, his correspondence, the letters that he received, some of the letters that he wrote, his musical compositions, his speeches, and all of that informs so much of what we do. And one of the guiding principles of our work is that it is through relationships that we learn best and grow best. And that isn't just reserved for children. So, of course, our children are learning through relationships in their families and in care environments and schools, and our youth are there in after school programming and in sports and music programs, and they're learning through relationships with adults all the time. But our adults still learn and grow best through relationships, also, our helpers. Now, why do we call them helpers? You'll hear me use that term a lot. And one of the reasons we call those who serve children and families or are there to help children in any way, we call them the helpers because that's the ultimate term of respect in Fred Rogers language. So when we think back to some of the probably most popular things that we hear about when we think of Fred Rogers, one of those is the idea of always looking for the helpers. We've heard this an awful lot over the last year. Now, the quote that we most often see is always look for the helpers. You'll always find people helping. And I'm sure many of you know the story behind that. That when Fred was a young boy and he was afraid, he asked his mom what he should do. And his mom told him to always look for the helpers because you'll always find people helping. And that's the part we hear most often. But that conversation continued. And Fred also shared with us that the reason his mother told him to look for the helpers is because when you see people helping, you know there is hope. So it's the helpers that give us such hope. It's those who are serving children and families and young people every single day that are providing so much hope in our world. And that's the work that we do here at the center is in service of those who are spreading that hope and those who are the helpers in the lives of children and youth and families. And that means family child care, it means foster care villages overseas, it means schools, it means childcare systems, it means specialized schools, children's hospitals. The lists are endless. So, the work that I am going to share with you a little bit today is work that we have learned from those helpers. You know, we've traveled far and wide to see what it looks like when helpers are working with children and young people and families and one another. And I'd like to share with you today 3 lessons that I've taken away from that work. 3 lessons about what it means to be in relationship with one another and why these human relationships are so very important and what we can continue to learn from our helpers, even in times of uncertainty and challenge that are emblematic of the last year. So, I'd like to start, of course, where we start at the center in all of our work, which is with Fred. Along the years, we've always talked with Joanne about some of the work that we've done. And there have been a number of times when I had asked her, what do you think Fred would think about that? Or what do you think Fred would do? And her response was always the same to me. She would say, Dana, he'd listen. Not only listen, but he'd listen first. And so in the work that we do at the center, we listen first. We listen to the words of Fred. We listen to the writings, the program, to guide some of our thinking as well. One of the quotes that we have been thinking about a lot over the last year is this idea of what it means to be in the midst of gusty winds. So we know that human relationships are incredibly important. And Fred shares with us that human relationships are primary in all of living. When the gusty winds blow and shake our lives, if we know that people care about us, we may bend with the wind, but we won't break. And when we think about human relationships, and I throw out that term, sometimes it can seem a bit scary. Relationships come in all shapes and sizes. And when we think about being in relationship, it's hard to think about what that means. How do we grow that? How do we start that? How do we sustain that? But one of the things that we have learned through many years of doing this work is that the power of those human relationships come from simple, ordinary moments. Simple, ordinary moments of interaction that sometimes may seem so simple that we don't even notice that it's happening. These are moments that are happening in 5 or 10 seconds. These are moments that are happening in big ways as well. But these simple moments are the building blocks of our human relationships, not just our relationships with children and with young people, but also our relationships with one another. That the power of those relationships really do come from the simplest, ordinary interactions. So I'd like to share with you some of those simple, ordinary interactions that we've come across throughout the years. And I mentioned some of the contexts where we've worked already: early care and education, early intervention, home visiting, orphanage environments overseas, in schools, in after school programs, informal learning, children's hospitals. But one of the places where we've worked that probably doesn't jump to mind if you think of, let's go to a place where human relationships are being grown in service of children and families. My guess is you probably wouldn't instantly think of crossing guards. You may not instantly think of the street corners where crossing guards are doing the hard work of keeping children and families safe as they cross from one side of the street to the other. However, when we began to work in these settings, we truly noticed what it means to string together the simplest of everyday moments into strong and deep relationships in service of children and families. So, if you are unfamiliar with the crossing guards in the city of Pittsburgh, there's about 110 of them across the city of Pittsburgh. And unlike some crossing guards in other areas, the crossing guards in Pittsburgh don't report to the school systems. They're not employees of school districts. They're employees of the Department of Public Safety in the city of Pittsburgh, which means that they are colleagues with the police officers. They share a building with the police officers, and the head of command there is the director of the Department of Safety and the chief of police. And so their work is very much around physical safety of individuals who are crossing the street. When they are trained to be crossing guards, they're trained in the proper hand signals to use and the way to cross people safely from one side of the street to the other, how to stop the traffic. But they're not given training all that often on anything beyond that physical safety. So when we took our cameras, and you can see me there on an early morning with my video camera on the side of the street, and started to film what it was that crossing guards did in those couple of hours in the morning and couple of hours in the afternoon, we found the seeds of these human relationships. We found these simple, everyday interactions that were being strung together. So I'd like to share with you just a glimpse into the morning of one of the most incredible crossing guards that I had the privilege of spending some time with. Now, with a lot of crossing guards across the city of Pittsburgh, we didn't get to see them all, but we did get to see a good number of them that are doing this all the time, that they are having this kind of practice when it comes to doing the job of safely crossing children and families from one side of the street to the other. So I'm going to introduce you to Miss Paula and think a little bit about what is it that you notice that Miss Paula does in the simplest of moments. She doesn't have a lot of time, but she sure makes the most of it. And think a little about what difference does Miss Paula make in those simple everyday moments.
Good morning. I like your hair. Go ahead. Where's your jacket at?
I'm not cold.
You ain't cold? Okay. Where's your, I know, see, you got a jacket, huh? He said, I am. Good morning. She's grown up to be so beautiful. Look at her. Wow. I know. Wow. She looks just like you. That's your twin right there. Oh my. Good morning. Y'all go to the high school?
Yes.
All right. Have a blessed day.
Thank you.
You're welcome, baby. And your lips are shivering.
All we care is about beautiful.
That's it. Me too. That's the worst time when my face is cold. Yeah, I feel like, oh, mama, shh. I wish I could just warm you up. But if it's just like my hair, I'm good. Okay.
My face is cold.
Well, hurry up in then. It's time to go in, okay? Good morning.
Right.
Good morning. So, Halsey, when are you going to know about the election? When you going to know if you won or not?
Okay.
Oh, huh. I got my fingers crossed for you. Even though I didn't get a cupcake, but I got my fingers crossed. Good morning, guys. Oh, your nails. Let me see your nails. All right, now. Let me see y'all of yours. All right, now. Go now. Your bad self. You cold?
Fall baby.
You a fall baby?
Yeah, my birthday's November.
See, I hold traffic for you. Good morning, baby girl. I like your little bun. Your mom did your hair? Tell her I give her 100%.
Well, that's just a little glimpse into Miss Paula's morning. And I asked you to think a little bit about what you noticed. And I see some great comments coming in through the chat already, that she's seeing everyone, that she's genuine and relatable, and she's greeting everyone. And it's true. I had to, of course, cut out a few moments in there to make it fit for, 2 minutes to show you today. But she did that with every single person who came even close to that crosswalk. And yeah, she makes me smile too. When I hear her laugh, sometimes I'll sit if I'm in a bad mood and just watch this video, because her laughter just, instantly brings a smile to my face. Now she sees every child and every family. And now she has maybe 5 or 10 seconds, just as long as it takes the children to cross the street, to interact and relate to them. She notices that the color on the nails have changed for some of the girls crossing the street, which is incredible to notice that. She remembers that the one young girl is running for office and wants to know when the election is. She sends a message home to mom. Tell your mom I give her 100% on that hair. She checks in from the very beginning. Where's your jacket at? And when I asked her about that, because that one made me giggle, when I asked her about that, she said, "Oh, I'm an early morning street parent." And that is precisely what she is. Now, when I mentioned earlier what the crossing guards are trained to do, this isn't necessarily a part of that checklist. Talking and getting to know every single child that crosses the street, that's something that the crossing guards do above and beyond their job duties. Now, with the little time that she has to talk to the kids and to the families, she tells me that sometimes the highlight of her morning is when she can get a high school student to take out the ear pod and just generally nod in her direction or say good morning. She says good morning to everyone. She gives them a smile. She has that little bit of helpful appreciation for every single child and family that comes across that street. Now, when she does that, she's building relationships with each and every one of those children, one simple moment at a time. And she does it with a couple of hours in the morning and a couple of hours in the afternoon. And that's all the time she has. So she makes the most of it. It's something that she does within her daily routine of keeping children and families safe as they cross the street. Now, what difference does that make? I can only imagine what difference it makes. And when we had the crossing guards all together and showed them videos of the amazing practice like what you just saw, they told me countless stories of how they were there for children and families, how they have been invited to Thanksgiving dinner and have been asked if they could be called grandma, and how they are crossing generations of families. And I shared a story with them because when you have a video camera on the side of the street and there's children around, they're going to come and see why you're there. And so I had a group of kids around me, and they were asking me what I was doing. And I told them that I wanted to know a little bit more about what Miss Paula did and what her day was like. And I asked this group of young men what they thought about their crossing guard. And one young man looked at me and said, "She wasn't here last week and I didn't know what to do." He said, "They didn't have a substitute crossing guard to help you cross the street?" And he said, "No, she wasn't here to say good morning, and my whole week felt weird." It's a pretty big difference to make in the lives of children in one small moment at a time. So when we think about what it means to be in human relationship, sometimes we can get caught up in the big R relationships, I like to call them, the attachment relationships, the relationships that we build in families, the relationships that we build as teachers, that all of these relationships are incredibly important to the learning and growing of children and young people and the adults who love them too. That there's no opportunity too small to start the building of those relationships because they are built from those simple, everyday interactions just strung together. Now, when we think about these interactions, and we've seen interactions just like this across hundreds of developmental settings and geographical regions, and no matter where we are, the interactions always come back to these four main dimensions that can help us to think about the interactions, can help us to reflect on our own interactions, and can hopefully give us the groundwork to grow more of these simple interactions in service of those relationships. When I watch this video, and I filmed it and I've probably seen it at this point thousands and thousands of times, I still see these four things. And they are just like the many comments that I've seen in the chat, you're seeing them too. So the first thing that we see is a sense of connection, that you can tell that Miss Paula is emotionally engaged with the children who cross the street, with the families who are there. You can tell that they are engaged with one another. They're sharing a common affect quite often, or that that emotional connection is incredibly important to how they engage with one another. That she is smiling and excited to see them. And when they see that, when the children see that, they can't help but match that smile and that excitement to share that affect and emotion back and forth. And when we think of connection, it's exactly what we think about is that emotional connection, the emotional engagement, the affect that we share when we're interacting. We also see a sense of reciprocity. Now, when we think about reciprocity, it means that when we're interacting, there are certain roles that we take. And sometimes those roles are more balanced than other times. And sometimes it's more appropriate to have them slightly imbalanced. Sometimes we're leading, sometimes we're following. And sometimes we have these beautiful serve and return interactions, those responsive interactions where one part is serving, the other's returning. We can't quite tell who's in control of the interaction, but we're having this wonderful exchange. And that's something that we see in very small moments here with Miss Paula, too, that she's able to ask questions, receive answers, extend those answers, and that happens in the shortest of moments. Next, and something that when we think about interactions and relationships might seem a little strange to be a part of these dimensions, but it's something that's incredibly important when we think about what it means to interact with one another, is what are we doing to support the interaction of those who might be least able or least likely to engage with us? And that's what we mean by inclusion. What kind of opportunities do we have to provide that engagement, to provide that interaction, and also to support the interaction of those who may not be used to those interactions, may not be likely to be a part of them, or who have been historically excluded from them? How are we making sure that everyone is having that opportunity to engage? And one thing I noticed as I watched Miss Paula for 2 hours is that she made sure everyone had the opportunity to have a conversation with her, that everybody was supported by getting a good morning, a smile, have a nice day, that those who came close to her, that she was engaging them in conversation, giving them a chance to be seen and heard. And she shared with me that she has no idea what has happened in the lives of those children before they get to the crosswalk. And she has no idea what will happen in the lives of those children after they leave that crosswalk, but that she has a responsibility for the crosswalk. She has a responsibility to be sure that every child gets to hear good morning from her. And she sees that responsibility as one of the most amazing gifts that she's been given. According to her, being a crossing guard is the best job she's ever had. Now, those kinds of inclusive interactions aren't restricted just for our crossing guards, but that's something that we can think about as well. What are we doing to support the engagement of everyone who comes close to us? How can we be sure that everybody's getting that smile, that good morning? If we're in our classroom, or if we're serving adults and families, are we making sure that those practices are inclusive, that we're noticing if somebody's being left out, and that we're doing everything we can to provide those opportunities to engage? And then finally, even in the smallest of moments, she's providing scaffolded opportunities for children and families to grow, not just grow in conversation, but grow in confidence, to grow in their own learning about one another and their friends. The opportunities are endless, even in the moments that you just saw. She's scaffolding those conversations based on what the children need. Now, this is only the third week of September, so she's been about a month on the job of that school year at this point, and she's asking questions and driving deeper. She's engaging with families, and she's providing them opportunities to get to know her just as she's getting to know them. And those are opportunities to grow in relationship with one another. So she's mindful of making sure that she's remembering what happens before. She's remembering that the day before that child had a coat and he doesn't have it this morning. She's remembering before that there was an election coming up and I need to make sure and check in. She's remembering before that, wow, her mom does really great hair. She needs to know it. Send that message back home. So we're looking at a crossing guard who has taken it upon herself, and just like a number of her colleagues, to care for children, not just in their physical sense, but also to care for them emotionally and socially as they cross the street each morning. And if we think about our own helping, whether we work with children directly, whether we work with those who serve children, whether we're just walking down the street, we can do the same. But it's important to remember that even though these moments are simple and these moments are happening all the time, that these moments aren't happening by accident. That if it's through these relationships that we grow best and learn best, it takes effort to build them. It takes effort in these interactions to build that trust. Miss Paula works hard to make sure that she's building that trust, that she's caring for those children and young people, and that she's there for them, that she is a consistent person in their lives to build those relationships. So, yes, are these moments simple? Absolutely, they are simple, but it doesn't mean that they don't take effort. It doesn't mean that we can't bring intention to them. And that's exactly what Miss Paula does in every one of those moments. So that's the first lesson that we've learned across a number of contexts. And that's that human relationships, the power of them comes from those simple, everyday moments. And those moments, they're still possible, even in the middle of a pandemic. We're still having them. They may look a little bit different because we've seen a lot of these signs recently. Closed, closed. There are a lot of closed doors right now. But something that I've come to know after talking and continuing to work with some of our helpers over the last year is that our helpers are far more than just one thing. And you better believe they're going to find that there is far more than just one way. So much has changed over the last year, and I don't think we can ignore any of that. That there has been an awful lot that has changed, but there's still so much that remains the same when we're thinking of working in service of others, working to support families, working to support other adults and children. When Fred was ending his career in television, he was asked a question of whether or not he believed that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood would remain relevant because childhood had changed so much. And he responded that while the outsides of childhood have certainly changed, the inner needs of children remain the same. And isn't that true about our work too? The outsides of how we do it have certainly changed. I don't know that I've ever been in one place for an entire year before. But the insides of why we do this work, they're still the same. And that might even be more important now. And it's something that when I was talking with a colleague very early on in this experience for all of us, we were talking about how, there's so many closed doors. And he remembered reading in a book that was written by Helen Keller. It was a memoir of Helen Keller about the metaphor of the closed door and the open window. And it's something that I remember hearing on, I think it was in The Sound of Music, actually. It said a couple of times that when one door closes, a window opens. And Helen Keller offered that when one door of happiness closes, another opens. But she went on to say that often we look so long at the closed door that we do not see the one which has been opened for us. Now, there are a lot of closed doors right now. And there are also a lot of opportunities for us to remember why we do the work we do and how we continue to do it. We were in the middle of a lot of projects where we were together. As you can tell, my work is all about interactions, and typically that means people are together to have those interactions. So this is a very, very different time for many of us. But we've found a lot of windows, haven't we? Some of these windows are Zoom windows, just like this. We shifted one of our projects. We were working in Boston Public Schools, and we shifted it to Zoom, and all of a sudden had double the participants, that they were coming to share time with us, even if it was through a window. We've seen beautiful pictures such as this one, where a doctor who was separated from his family because he was treating patients who had COVID saw his own son crawl for the first time through a window. There have been many windows open to us. Now, when I started to think a little bit more about what it means to have this closed door and open window, I think my fear was that if the doors were closed, that what happens if they don't reopen? I think they will. I think a lot of these doors will reopen. And I started to think a little bit more about, is this new? Is this, I know the situation that we currently find ourselves in is certainly something we haven't been through, but the way of looking for open windows, the way of innovating for our helpers, that's not new. And I started to think a little bit more about when we think about how we're going to serve adults and children and families, and we may have a plan in place, and it turns out to be a plan that's a little bit like a rock wall, climbing a rock wall. That when we're standing at the bottom of the rock wall, we might be able to see a clear path for where we're headed. However, when we get up to that actual place, we see that, oh my, we can't quite make that one handhold, and this looks a little bit different when we're in it than when it looked when we were on the ground, which means we have to adapt, which means we have to innovate. And it's something that we have seen our helpers do throughout this entire time. And it's because our helpers are far more than just their job descriptions. That those who are working to support children and families and young people, they are what Fred would call more than one thing. Fred talked about this when he was giving a speech in the 1980s. And he said that what's been important in my understanding of myself and others is the fact that each one of us is so much more than any one thing. A sick child is much more than his or her sickness. A person with a disability is much, much more than a handicap. A pediatrician is more than a medical doctor. You're much more than your job description or your age or your income or your outfit. So what does it mean to be more than one thing? Well, we've been thinking a lot about this for a couple of years now at the Fred Rogers Center. And it's because when we think about being more than one thing, It's about acknowledging that each one of us is more than one thing. It's about seeing beyond for each of us. But it's also about accepting for ourselves that we too are more than just one thing. And when we are more than just one thing, it means that there's also more than one way to build relationships, to have interactions. There's more than one way to help. And that's what we saw over the last year. I was in the middle of a project in Pennsylvania. We were looking at family engagement relationships. And when the school shut down, those family engagement relationships were really difficult to see and to capture. But then we started working with our friends in early intervention. And we started working with some friends in home visiting to see what these virtual interventions and virtual home visits looked like. And what we found was that our families and our helpers were working together through new windows. They were innovating, they were adapting, they were finding what more they were than just their one thing, and they were finding more than one way to be in relationship with one another. So that's the second lesson I'd like to share with you is, especially over the last year, we have certainly learned that each one of us is more than just one thing, and that there is more than just one way to do the work of helping, to build relationships with one another, and to sustain those relationships, even when the outsides look very, very different. I'd like to come back to the quote that I used in the very beginning to think about this third lesson. And that quote was always look for the helpers, because when you look for the helpers, you'll know that there is hope. And this is a lesson that we've learned across our time, but it's also a bit of a call to action for all of us. And that is our helpers give a lot of hope, but they need help too. When we think about the systems and structures and all of the organizations that are working to support one another, we know that we are firmly in this work because we truly want to support children, young people, families, other adults to grow, to learn, to develop, to thrive. And what does it mean to do this when we're in relationship with one another? Sometimes we think of relationships, as I mentioned before, as those big R relationships. And we hope that that's where relationships are beginning for children, that children are building these kinds of relationships in their homes with families, with caregivers, with family members outside of the home, but that these relationships are happening between children and young people and their families. We also know that children are building these relationships with helpers. So, our home visitors, our Head Start teachers, our early care and providers, our K through 12 teachers, the list goes on and on. Miss Paula, the crossing guard. That there are so many helpers that come in and out of the lives of our children that our children are building these relationships with, right alongside building relationships with their family. That these simple interactions are a part of the everyday lives of children when they're in home and outside of the home. Now, if we think about the most important thing that we can give to children are these relationships, that all learning and growing happens within these relationships. So being able to support children with relationships on both the side of the family and the side of the helper is an incredible way to help children to learn and to grow. But even when we look at this picture here, we know that the relationships directly with children are incredibly important, but that in the end, those relationships can only go so far. That to truly work in service of that child's learning and growing, we have to have relationships among the adults here too. That our helpers and our families are working together in relationship in service of the learning and growing of children or young people. Now, when we think about what those relationships mean, oftentimes they're referred to as family engagement relationships in a formal setting, or they're relationships between teachers and families or coaches and families. But sometimes these relationships can feel a little bit one sided, like there's one person driving and the other person following. But for these relationships to be truly meaningful, they've got to be reciprocal. They've got to be two-way. They've got to be a true partnership. And when we think about what it means to be in relationship between a family and a helper, it's working from that same assumption that we are doing this work together because we want the best for our children and young people. That if we work from that assumption, then we're already working from common ground. And common ground is the foundation for that respect. That we're respecting each other back and forth. We're sharing our knowledge, we're sharing our expertise when it comes to being a family, our expertise about our child, our expertise about teaching. We're sharing that willingly back and forth to build that partnership in an effort to support the learning and growing of children. Now, this triangle here, I think, is just a beautiful, beautiful picture of what it means to be in a relationship focused vision in support of children. But we also know that this isn't happening in a vacuum and that this right here isn't enough for the adults. That we have to be able to build strong, supportive communities for our families. What do those supportive communities look like? Well, they could look like neighborhoods. They could look like extended family. They can look like support services that help families. But that we have to support our families in relationship with one another to be able to support those relationships that they're building with children. And while we're building those relationships with our families in support of the interactions they're having in their homes, we can't forget about our helpers too. That our helpers need those same communities of relationships. Now, oftentimes we hear in professional settings of these being referred to as communities of practice, where helpers can come together to share practice, to share successes, to share challenges, to advocate together for resources and things that they need to do their jobs well. But that these communities are so very important. And they are built upon that foundation of relationships also. And we can't forget that as children grow, that community of peers becomes so very, very important for them also. And they're learning to interact and build relationships with their peers based on the relationships that they're catching around them. It's one of those places where the Quaker saying of attitudes are caught, not just taught, so true of relationships. That children are catching what those relationships look like and feel like, and then putting those into practice when they're building relationships with their peers. Now, when we look at a system that looks like this, you may see yourself in a number of different heads here. Big heads, little heads, orange heads, blue heads. There's all types of places where we find ourselves within the system building relationships and having interactions. But that can also be a bit overwhelming to feel like you have a responsibility for so many of these little heads on the screen. And that's when we're reminded that we all can't change this system one it just being one person, but to start to change a system, to start to build these relationships, it means having a ripple that touches just one person. And that's when we think of the responsibility that we have or the role that we have to build those relationships. That if we're doing our part within those relationships, that sooner or later they're going to ripple across this entire system. That in each one of these touch points, if it's built upon the foundation of relationships, then we're doing everything we can to support the learning and growing of not just our children, but of our adults as well. And it means that at each one of these touch points, we can ask ourselves a question to be sure that we are prioritizing the importance of relationships every step along the way. And that question is this: how does whatever it is that we're doing, whether we're engaged in some type of practice or we're responsible for different program level decisions or policy decisions, I'll do any of those decisions, help to encourage, enrich, and empower human interactions and relationships around children, families, and their helpers. Because if we truly believe that all learning and growing happens within these relationships, that these relationships are the most important thing to help our children and families to bend with the wind but not break, then all of our decisions should be in service of encouraging the development of these relationships. Because think about what the flip side of this question could be. What are we doing that discourages or disempowers relationships to be built? So we can think about that as well. Now, that pretty picture that I just had on the screen of this system all working well together certainly doesn't feel like that right now, does it? We can't really be together in the same ways as when I drew that picture a couple of years ago with my colleagues. Right now, it might feel a little bit more like this, that we have physical distancing, which has been a part of our lives now for nearly a year. We have changes in how our children are going to school and how our families are with our children. And so sometimes it feels like as helpers, we're on the outside looking in, trying to find more than one way, be more than one thing to be able to serve. Now, in conversation with many of the helpers that you've seen on slides here today, one thing I've learned over the last year is that our helpers are feeling incredibly isolated. They're feeling under supported in the role of helping, right? Because life has changed so quickly, but the expectation is still that they show up and that they are there and they find ways to support families and children. And they've done it brilliantly. They've adapted, they've innovated, and they've come together in support of one another. And I think if we want to rebuild this system, if we want to rebuild what we hope is a relationship focused vision for serving children and families, then we need to start with our helpers. And we need to make sure that they have the support and respect and trust that they need to do their work. And that's what we found is that they've come together to find new ways to learn together and to be able to support one another in the work of continuing to serve children and families and young people. That they've found ways to come together to sustain or even to build those relationships through very new open windows when there are so many doors that are currently closed. And we know that as this time progresses, that this whole system will slowly be rebuilt to what it was before. But it means beginning with our helpers. It means that when Fred said that we need to think of children first, I don't think he was wrong there. We think of children first. If we have anything to do with the learning and growing of children, we listen to children, we learn from them, we learn about them, we think of them first. But I think next, after we think of the children, we need to start thinking of our helpers because they need help too. We've got to think of our helpers next. We've got to listen to them. We've got to learn about them. We've got to learn from them because we will not make a lasting impact on children and families if we're skipping over the needs of the adults. It just won't happen. For helpers to continue the important role of helping, we have to do for them what they're doing for children and families. We have to help to support them in environments of relationships. We have to provide relationships of connection and reciprocity and inclusion and opportunity to grow, to help them to continue to do the work that they do each and every day. It means that when we rebuild this system and we think of the touch points that we have within it, I hope that we do so with a greater trust and respect and a greater amount of support for our helpers. They're the ones who have brought so much hope over the last year. They're the ones who continue to do the work even though doors are closed and windows are open. And that's what it means to be in relationship with one another, is that when you have that connection to another person, when you can have that at least one other person or be that at least one for another person, that connection is one of the most important things we can have to grow our own resilience. We know that resilience in the literature, years and years of research related to resilience when we're thinking about how children grow to somehow overcome uncertainty and adversity, that most often they speak about at least one human relationship that helped them through that. And that's not reserved just for children. We want to be that at least one for children, but we also want to be that at least one for one another. That power of human connection is so important to help each one of us to bend with the gusty winds, but not break. So then it makes our question expand a bit, that we're building those relationships in an effort to build those human connections and support, especially in times like this that are very uncertain and incredibly challenging for each one of us. I think the number one thing I've taken to heart over this last year is something that I heard very early on. And I wish I could remember who said it originally, but it was that we are all in the same storm, but we're certainly not in the same boat. And that means that connection and support for one another is even more important, because we can't always know what that more than one thing is that people are facing, but we can certainly be there as that helpful appreciator to help them to bend with the wind, but not break. So the 3 lessons that I'm so grateful to share with you today. Number 1, that the power of human relationships comes from simple, ordinary moments. Number 2, we are all more than just one thing, and there is certainly more than just one way to help one another. And number 3, our helpers need help too. So what can we do to be sure that we are surrounding them in those same relationships that we offer to children and families? That we're there to support and trust and respect our helpers too. Now, you can't have a visit from the Fred Rogers Center without a visit directly from a video of Fred. It's one of the highlights of my work. Nancy asked me earlier what my favorite part of my job was, and I said there were 22,000 of them in the archive underneath me. But one of my favorite things is sharing little known video clips of Fred at times. And I think it's one of those gifts that we at the center are able to uniquely provide. So one of the clips that I'd like to share with you today is something that, as we've all faced the last year, the number of times we've gotten a phone call or an email that has asked us, oh my, what would Fred do about these times? Or the number of times I've read in an article, sure wish Fred Rogers was here to help. Well, we certainly do too. But in the archive, we have a number of arrows pointing to ways that maybe he would have helped, and ways that we can continue to help by keeping that legacy alive too. Now, the video I'd like to share with you today is a video that Fred recorded in support of those who were helping children and families during a very difficult time in our nation's history. This video comes from the 1-year anniversary of the events of September 11th. So this was recorded in August of 2002 in memory of the 1-year anniversary of September 11th. Now also, it's one of the final clips we have of Fred. Fred passed away in February of 2003, so just a few months later. But in this video, he extends a message that I would like to extend for these times as well, which is extreme gratitude and thanks for the work that you all continue to do, even when the gusty winds are certainly blowing around each one of you just as much as they are around the children and families. So it's a message of thanks for that work, and a message of hope and support for the days and years and months ahead. So here's a final message from Fred.
You know, it happens so often. I walk down the street and someone 20 or 30 or 40 years old will come up to me and say, "You are Mr. Rogers, aren't you?" And then they tell me about growing up with the neighborhood, and how they're passing on to the children they know what they found to be important in our television work, like expressing their feelings through music and art and dance and sports and drama and computers and writing, and invariably we end our little time together with a hug. I'm just so proud of all of you who have grown up with us, and I know how tough it is some days to look with hope and confidence on the months and years ahead. But I would like to tell you what I often told you when you were much younger. I like you just the way you are. And what's more, I'm so grateful to you for helping the children in your life to know that you'll do everything you can to keep them safe and to help them express their feelings in ways that will bring healing in many different neighborhoods. It's such a good feeling to know that we're lifelong friends.
And with that, I want to thank you for spending a little bit of time together here today, in whatever way together means for us. But I deeply appreciate the time that you've spent here in thinking about these things with me. And I look forward to our lifelong friendship in service of children and families and one another. And now it's question and answer time. Am I right, Nancy?
Yes, you are. Though I'm not Nancy.
Sorry. Or Jamal or Mark.
Thank you, Dana. That was a very moving presentation. I think it made, for me at least, think about everything that we've kind of been through this year, and especially sort of with that first video that you started with the crossing guard. It made me think about all of the opportunities and chances for interaction that for physical interaction, at least, that we've missed this year. And it made me think about all of the times that I would go into work and then go into the building and see the security guards and how our interactions would kind of start my day and how they were always so positive. So thank you for that. It just brought back some memories, got me thinking about some things.
Jamal, may
Question.
I, may
Sure,
I
Nate.
just jump in? There were a couple of things that, these are not questions, these are comments. And I don't know how many people said the same thing, how soothing your voice is. And I would say that I almost felt the spirit of Fred Rogers with us today. And I, among many, feel just better having listened to you and been here today. And I want to
Thank you.
thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to tell you there was one comment from Denmark and that said, thank you for this wonderful session, very encouraging, clear and usable. The 3 points she will be taking with her. So I just thought I would share that from Denmark.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nancy. I appreciate that very much.
I have a friend of mine who is in the audience and attending a presentation right now, and she said, "You are the female Mrs. Rogers, Mr.
Oh my.
Rogers." So
Wow.
shoes there. Um, we, if you have any questions for the audience, there's a Q&A tab. It should be to the left of the chat feature. If you could put any of your questions in there, that would be awesome. And we'll start with Christine's question. Has the Rogers Institute considered partnering with the Department of Education in showing episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood daily as a part of educational curriculum for children in K-3 grades?
So that is a fantastic question. And I will tell you that while we haven't partnered directly with the Department of Education, we have for the last 2 years been running a project out of the Fred Rogers Center where we are supporting educators to engage with episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. and with the Fred Rogers Archive in service of their own teaching practice. So that initiative is called Educators Neighborhood. And currently we have our first year we piloted with 10 teachers just in the Pittsburgh area to see how it worked. And this year we opened it up a little bit more and we have 65 teachers from across the country who are working with this program. And so they sometimes will show clips of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood within their own classrooms, or they use it to inform their own teaching practice. Like ideas around how we slow down, how we deliberately leave space, the use of everyday materials in learning. So if you're interested in more information on the Educators Neighborhood, you can find it on the Fred Rogers Center website, fredrogerscenter.org.
Thank you. Amy asks, how would you suggest agencies who struggle under limited budgets provide the support to their helpers?
So a lot of the contexts that we have been so privileged to work in are under incredible strain financially. If you think of a lot of helping professions, I don't know that any of them are have all of the resources that they need. And what we've found remarkable is that regardless of the resources, we see an immense amount of resourcefulness in the people. And so it doesn't take large budgets or resources to support one another. However, one thing that we have found is that when folks are able to come together in community, that those communities can work to advocate for one another and advocate collectively for more resources. It's something that we've seen really start to take shape, especially over the last year with our childcare sector, is that we've been able to come together and really advocate. And while we're far from getting all of the resources that we need, when we're able to show and demonstrate what that helping looks like and bring people a little closer to the interactions that we're having with others, that it certainly helps to open eyes as to what we need in the field as far as resources are concerned. So I wouldn't count out our resourcefulness, but I would also say, even though we're resourceful, doesn't mean we don't need the resources too.
Ask if there were just one thing that you could recommend for a plan to stop child abuse in PA, what might that be?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, I'm gonna take just a quick pause here and think.
Okay.
Just
No
one
worries.
thing. Wow. Um, you know, when I talked about how we can't make a lasting impact on children if we're skipping over the adults,
Mhm.
it you know, I coincidentally I actually started my career working within the prison system in the state of Pennsylvania, and I worked directly with inmates who were about to be released to find retraining programs and find ways so that they would not come back to my classroom in the jails. And it's something when we listen and we hear the stories of others and we equip them with the support to do the good that they know is right. That if we work from the assumption that all families truly do want the best from for their children, and sometimes they need support and reminders of what that means. I think the one thing is that I would love to provide those support and reminders to all families of what that means.
Thank you. I think that's a great answer. I think it's a very nuanced question, but I thought I'd ask it just to see what your thoughts might be. So um, Maria says she works in a family center in Clarion, Venango, Butler, and Armstrong counties. Are there materials available for us to use with families?
Mhm. So there's a couple of answers there, Maria. I would recommend the Fred Rogers Center website. So one of the initiatives that we do, in addition to the work that I talked about today with Simple Interactions, is that since we're located on a college campus, we have teams of students who have been working to create resource documents to help families to talk with their children about difficult topics. So very much in line with how Fred talked about difficult things on television through Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So we've got a number of resources there that may be of interest to you. It's in support of families or caregivers or adults talking to children about difficult things such as death or cancer diagnosis, substance use, divorce, difficult things in the news. And our students continue to find new ideas and avenues to add to those resources. If you're thinking about things directly related to interactions and relationships, a lot of what I shared today is available on simpleinteractions.org, which is the collaborative of the Simple Interactions work. Myself, Dr. Tom Akiva at the University of Pittsburgh, who focuses in youth settings, and Dr. Junlei Lee at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. That we all partner in this work around interactions in relation to families as well. So you might be able to find some helpful resources there. And then, of course, you have my information, and I'm always happy to have a conversation there too.
Thank you. Michelle asks, how can we help parents and children to know that despite being alone physically, they aren't truly alone?
Yeah, those are the simple moments that I have been amazed at the power of a handwritten note recently. My daughter has started to do that with some of her friends, and the joy on her face when one comes back to her has been amazing. It's one of those really simple things that I wouldn't have really thought of myself. But there are ways to send simple reminders again. That even though we feel physically distant from one another, I hesitate to use the word socially distant because I don't think we are socially distant. There are a number of ways where we can socially connect. They just look a lot different. So we're physically distant from one another, but there are a lot of ways for us to continue to connect.
Thank you. That's a great idea. Pen pals and handwritten notes and cards. Those are they make you feel something, and doing that during this time, I think, would be a really big thing. Dan asked, when it comes to reciprocity, some people are easier to work with than others. What techniques or what approach do you recommend when someone is fighting or challenging your efforts to help them?
Yes. So that's one thing where I talked earlier about how relationships can be challenging at times and scary, and sometimes it helps to think about them in their little pieces. Um, I think sometimes when we're in relationships with one another, we want those kind of instant results that, I'm here, I'm ready to help, and we're going to do this right now. And a lot of times it takes far longer than that. I think sometimes when we're in relationship, especially among adults, we try to instantly get to the opportunities to grow, and instead of taking our time in the connection and reciprocity and inclusion parts. So sometimes, yes, there can be very challenging to be in relationship with one another, but through simple times of connection, by also with reciprocity, the core of reciprocity is in power also. How do we share our power? That even though we're here to help, that the other person has agency in how that happens and the way that we do it. That we can think about that type of trust and respect for one another as well when we're in relationship. And that there's no easy way. Remember, it's not going to happen by accident. It's going to take work. It's going to take time. But I have definitely come to learn it's worth the effort.
Thank you. Lou asks, she says, our organization has done many things to support staff with vicarious trauma, self-care, work-life balance. Are we seeing any research on the impact of these efforts? What helps more? I have some concerns that these approaches are valuable. We are not doing enough, however.
So this gets back to the idea that for our helpers to continue helping, they must be well. And what does it mean to be well? It means a lot, actually. That it's not there's no simple answer to what it means for folks to be well. There's been a number of studies that have come out recently looking at what it means for our helpers to be well. One of them was around Head Start teachers in Pennsylvania, where they were looking at um, teacher levels of depression, teacher levels of psychological safety within the workplace, and finding that when teachers are in relationship, when teachers have communities around them, especially, that they tend to report lower levels of depression and higher levels of psychological safety within the workplace. So I think that those relationships and support are huge. And those, while they're built in simple moments, they can't be just a one and done kind of thing. That those relationships must continue to grow and evolve and support as the many changes happen. You know, none of us saw this coming a year ago. So we were talking about vicarious trauma a year ago, and it has only gotten worse. And how do we continue that support in ways that reach one another, even given our limitations that we have?
Thank you. Terrence asked, are there other mediums to watch Mr. Rogers? Amazon Prime has a few seasons, but the rest are only available through purchase. It seems kind of sad to have a public television show be stuck behind a paywall. So Terrence wants to know, do you know of any other way to watch Mr. Rogers?
Yes. So Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is still owned by Fred Rogers Productions, which was Family Communications. That was Fred's production group that produced Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And Fred Rogers Productions has started a MrRogers.org that launches 5 episodes of Mr. Rogers for free. I believe it's every other week. And so they kind of go in rotation. That's a way to view them for free. I know that Amazon does have a limited amount available as well. Unfortunately, I don't have them either. So I have to kind of, I go down and sit outside our archivist's office, and sometimes she shares them with me. But I have to have a specific ask also. So there are some available, and then there's also, I believe they're working on the ability to share them more widely through that MrRogers.org. So I would stay tuned on there.
Thank you. Catherine asked, she would like your opinion on reforming the use of right and wrong with healthy and unhealthy.
That might be a question I need a little more context. If Catherine
Okay.
is still there and interested in providing a little more context on in what spaces. Are we talking about young children? Are we talking about adults? That would be helpful in me thinking.
Thank you. So if Catherine, if you have anything to add to that question that would help Dr. Winters answer, please add that to the Q&A and I will come back to it. We have an anonymous attendee who is a counselor asking this question. It says, do you feel the focus on billable services have made people forget about these simple interactions? I find that these are sometimes more powerful than any counseling or billable technique. And they say that this program was a great reminder of that.
So I think the systems around us are always going to be there and are always going to push down into our understanding of how we help one another. There's another quote from Fred Rogers that guides a lot of our work that is, the deep and simple is far more essential than the shallow and complex. And what I think around the idea of relationships, it's reminders of what is deep and simple of our work. And that goes for counseling, that goes for teaching, that there will be plenty of things in the system and in the structures of our work that will try to push their way into our practice. And it's up to us to remember the simple and deep, which means that, you know, the parts of our work that might seem like they are the least important, or it might seem like they are just the easiest to do. They're too simple, but they can be the ones that are most deeply felt by those that we serve. Children, by adults, by whomever that happens to be. And how do we preference that over the parts of our work that are maybe more shallow and complex? Not saying that the complexities, we can just toss them out. Sometimes they're absolutely necessary in our world, like, you know, billable, you do want to get paid. But how do we think of what's the most essential part of what we do and give a little preference to that as well?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Catherine came back and she said about young children. So the question was, I would like your opinion on reforming the use of right and wrong with healthy and unhealthy as far as young children are concerned.
Mm-hmm. I think that there are times and places for the use of terms when it comes to ideas of right and wrong. I've been working recently with a few schools around how we talk with young children about racism. And we've been starting to talk about what it means to be fair and unfair instead of right and wrong, because it's a concept that is tied to right and wrong, but it is a concept that can be felt more deeply and it's a little more nuanced, which I also see as healthy and unhealthy as one of those kind of dichotomy terms that are a little more nuanced than simply being right or wrong. That there's, and I think when we think of right or wrong, we can get stuck on either side, and there's only one answer. What I find with fair and unfair and unhealthy and healthy is that there's a lot of room in the middle to explore. And I think it's the exploration in the middle that can be most helpful for young children as they build their conception of what is right and wrong, what is healthy and unhealthy, what is fair and unfair.
Thank you. Mary asks, how can we convince parents that what they are perceiving as we are losing time due to us being apart can be reshaped to look for positives, and that we can make up for this lost time in the long run?
Yes. Um, I am slightly concerned about the narrative around we've lost time. And when I look at it, have there been opportunities that we've missed because of our current circumstances? There have been, but there have also been countless opportunities that we've been able to recognize and build within our children as well. And I agree. I'm worried about how we reframe that and reshape that. And I think when I think back to Fred's conception of what it means to be ready to learn, I think this is the place where I've heard the most about losing time, is that, oh, we've lost time in the schooling and we've lost time in academic growth and we've lost time as far as our kids learning. But for Fred, learning readiness was around 6 things that had nothing to do with ABCs, one, two, threes, recognizing letters. Those 6 things were a sense of trust, a sense of self-worth, curiosity, the capacity to look and listen carefully, the capacity to play, and solitude. And those 6 things are certainly still possible now, that we're learning in ways that we can't even imagine yet during this time. So has there been lost time? There's been time that has changed. I don't think it's been lost.
Agreed. Robin would like to ask, what are your thoughts regarding telehealth, and do you think it will be a regular part of our society?
Yeah. So I will readily admit that I was incredibly hesitant around all types of teleintervention, telehealth, virtual visits. Again, my work is kind of, it's predicated on people being together, and I will always believe that that is best. However, the opportunities that I've been able to observe in telehealth and teleintervention, I think that we can find a really strong balance. I have been able to see a number of relationships be sustained because of teleintervention. I've also seen teleintervention be able to reach people who previously were very hesitant to engage in relationship and interaction in certain health services. And I think that that is a tremendous thing that should be kept in mind. So I think that it probably is here to stay. I think that we have to find a balance, like all things that involve a screen. It's how we use it that matters most. It's not whether it's there or not, but how are we using it? Are we using it to reach those who previously were excluded? Are we using it to build or sustain relationship? Then it's got a place.
Agreed. It's funny. It's kind of like I've been having these conversations about telehealth, and I mean even movie theaters, just about how things have changed with a lot of these things since we've been under these restrictions, and the way that some of these things are going to be here to stay. It's just about how we kind of adapt to them and use them in the right way. So yeah, it's a very interesting interesting thought in trying to figure those things out. Michael asked, he said, Carl Rogers' approach has been described as informed simplicity. And he's wondering if you see any similarities between the two Rogers.
You know what I have? I remember reading Carl Rogers and in thinking about it in relation to Fred Rogers and wondering if it was just something with the name. I think there's some definite overlap there. And when we think about the kind of the becoming of those relationships too, I certainly see that overlap, but I have yet to find any indication that they intentionally overlapped. I've actually asked our archivist about it before, but I'll keep digging on that one because I think that there was definitely some reciprocal influence there.
Tori asks, I am a helper who is also a home visitor. Right now we are in homes and my families are wary of Zoom. Any advice on how to engage them again in this way due to restrictions?
Yes. I think I mean, as home visitors, I think we're always balancing the comfort of our families with the services that we provide. I had a talk last week with a home visitor who said, I just threw out my checklist for the day. And yeah, sometimes that's going to be absolutely necessary. Just throw out that checklist. And I think when we re-engage with those families in being in homes or in Zoom, it's I'm going to go back to my kind of age-old response to these things. We listen. We listen to what that fear is. We listen to what that need is. And as helpers, we find a way to support that. If they're hesitant to Zoom, are they hesitant to a text message? Are they hesitant to a phone call? We have home visitors in Philadelphia right now we're working with who have been using WhatsApp because that's the place that they've gone. I've got so many apps on my phone right now, I can't even tell what dings because we're meeting people where they are to provide that support. And I think that's something that the pandemic has taught us is that we've got more tools than we realized on how to reach out and support one another.
So I have a lot of resource questions that I'm going to try to throw all together and see how you handle that.
Oh my,
So,
like rapid fire. I'm ready. Okay.
Deborah and Michelle are asking for Deborah's for specific resources you would recommend for helpers working with teens, and Michelle is asking for resources or research that can be provided to upper levels of administration regarding the benefits of supporting the helpers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, helpers working with teams. I have found incredible support with the Forum for Youth Investment. Also, the Weichert Center on Youth Development. They have provided amazing resources on working with youth and teens. I would highly recommend them. They're very relational as well. When it comes to administrators and leaders and supporters of helpers and how to entice them to that support. It's funny, when we started this work, we were always working on the ground with helpers, and the constant message we heard is, do you know who needs to hear this message? They need to hear this message. And so we started working with administrators, and you know what they told us? You know who needs to hear this message? They need to hear this message. And so everybody has a they, is what I've learned. I haven't had a conversation with anybody who has the extreme power to not have a they yet. I mean, if that person's out there and wants to give me a call, I'm happy to have the conversation. But I think we're always looking for ways to think about how our supporters can support. There's a number of research studies that I would imagine are going to come out of this time as well, telling us about why that support is so important. But I think that if you're looking in education fields, that there are a number of high quality publications that come out that are research based, but also I would ask to look at the practice-based ones as well. The trade magazines, the ones, the Education Week that are coming out and saying, hey, we've got to do more to support our helpers. We're seeing those in our listservs constantly, and I wouldn't disregard the importance of those stories just because they aren't in a research-based way.
Thank you. And this will probably be our last question. And I wanted to save this one for last because it's about a difficult topic. Ricky asked, it's a question surrounding sexuality, and he understands why it's such a hard thing to cover with early learners. But he believes that we would all benefit from some of Fred's thoughts on the matter. As he said, anything mentionable is manageable. And he wanted to know, did the foundation have any resources around this topic? Was this topic ever sort of broached?
Mm-hmm. So the idea of what is mentionable is manageable is, I think, is the foundation of all of these difficult discussions. And it's having the discussions that is the most important. And it means bringing the imperfections to the discussions as well. It is not something that we have found a great deal of information in the archive about. It's not something that Fred necessarily wrote about. We found bits and pieces. There have been places when we talk about gender identity or normative values assigned to gender, there have been occasions where Fred had gone back and re-recorded segments of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to no longer refer to all women as housewives, or certain things that were more contemporary ideas and learnings about gender normative values there. When it comes to talking with children about these things, it is, it's the same as when we think about talking with children about difficult topics, which is we start very much with simple, honest questions and answers. That we provide as much information as we can in a simple, honest, and appropriate way for the age of the child. And sometimes that starts with questions to understand what the child is thinking, what the children are knowing, what the children are catching about these topics. It's not something that we have a resource on yet, but I will tell you it's in the works. So it's something that when we come to a topic like this, where it's not my expertise and no one on my staff has expertise, we start to find those who are the listeners and the experts in that area. So we'll bring the Fred, and the experts will bring the science and the research, and we will come together around resources around that. So I feel like I've said stay tuned a couple of times, but this is one of those places for stay tuned. And I do hope that if it's mentionable, it is manageable. And if those are discussions that you are having with children in your life, that you're doing so in ways that are in that environment of relationship and care and trust, and that keeps them coming back for more.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winters. I will pass it over to Mark to close us out. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you again.
All right.
Thank you, Jamal.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Winters, for this presentation. And really ultimately speaking about the importance of communication in these kind of complex worlds and complex systems by using these ideas of simple interactions. I love your they thing. I teach this. We always say the they, and it really comes back to us and how do we change? How do we adapt to the situation to make that change? And it also really just reminds me of how can we be that Miss Paula of your community, building that meaningful conversations, encouraging, enriching, and empowering the lives of children, youth, and family, being that kind of safety net for everybody. And just a huge thank you. One of my mentors was on the webinar and had put in there that this was just such a needed discussion in this kind of time right now. And the fact that we are able to connect in these virtual worlds, and the families and youth and children are able to do that as well with the workers that really care about their success. Our next presentation will be on March 25th, 2021, starting at 2:30. And that's going to be a presentation by Dr. Bertice Berry, speaking on a story of hope. We look forward to seeing you then. And thank you all for your fantastic attendance, great questions, and really just a real positive feeling going forward. So thank you again, Dr. Winters.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Winters.
And with that, wish everybody a fantastic day.